In this episode, we're going to talk about a kind of privacy harm that does not always look like a data breach, yet can feel just as violating: dark patterns. Dark patterns are design choices that steer people into actions they might not otherwise choose if options were presented clearly and fairly. In a privacy context, dark patterns often push users towards sharing more data, accepting broader tracking, or enabling features that increase monitoring, while making privacy-protective choices harder to find, harder to understand, or emotionally uncomfortable. The problem is not that a user clicked yes. The problem is that the system shaped that click through confusion, pressure, or misdirection. Eliminating dark patterns by design means building interfaces and workflows that respect a user's agency, present choices honestly, and align product incentives with privacy expectations. For beginners, it helps to see that privacy engineering is not only about encryption and access control, because the interface is where people decide what they are agreeing to, and manipulation at that moment is a direct privacy risk. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CIPT.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful first step is to understand why dark patterns appear, because they usually arise from incentives rather than from a single malicious designer. Teams are often measured on growth, retention, or revenue, and the fastest way to move those numbers can be to maximize permissions and tracking. That can lead to patterns like burying privacy settings, using confusing language to describe tracking, making opt-out flows long and exhausting, or presenting choices in a way that frames privacy as a bad decision. Over time, these patterns become normalized because they work, meaning they increase acceptance rates. The privacy engineering perspective challenges this normalization by asking whether the system is obtaining meaningful consent or merely obtaining compliance. Consent that is extracted through manipulation is fragile because it depends on user confusion, and it collapses when people realize what happened. Eliminating dark patterns is therefore both an ethical goal and a risk management goal, because deceptive design creates backlash, legal exposure, and long-term distrust. A dark pattern is often easiest to spot when you imagine a simple fairness test. If the user wanted the privacy-protective option, would the interface help them find it, understand it, and choose it without punishment? If the answer is no, the design is likely steering rather than informing. Steering can happen through layout, such as putting an acceptance button in a prominent place and hiding the decline option. It can happen through language, such as describing tracking as necessary when it is actually optional. It can happen through emotional framing, such as implying that declining tracking will harm the user or will make the product worse in vague ways. It can also happen through friction, such as requiring many extra steps to opt out while allowing opt-in with one click. Privacy engineering eliminates dark patterns by removing these asymmetries and making choices symmetrical, understandable, and stable over time. One common manipulation in privacy flows is bundling, where multiple distinct decisions are combined into one broad choice. For example, a single toggle might cover essential service functionality, optional analytics, marketing personalization, and third-party advertising. Bundling pushes people to accept more than they intended because they cannot separate what they need from what they do not want. A privacy-friendly design separates decisions that have different purposes and different impacts, while still keeping the interface comprehensible. The goal is not to overwhelm users with endless toggles, but to avoid forcing them into an all-or-nothing choice that benefits the system at the expense of agency. Bundling also creates internal confusion because teams start treating the broad consent as permission for any use, which expands secondary uses over time. Eliminating bundling is therefore a structural privacy control because it limits how far consent can be stretched. When choices are separated by purpose, privacy outcomes become clearer and more defensible. Another frequent dark pattern is obstruction, which is when the system makes privacy-protective actions deliberately difficult. Obstruction can look like hiding settings deep in menus, requiring repeated confirmations, or making users re-opt out after updates. It can also look like time-consuming flows that try to wear the user down, such as asking them to explain why they want privacy or making them toggle off many options one by one after they already chose a global decline. Obstruction is especially harmful because it weaponizes human fatigue, and fatigue is predictable. Privacy engineering counters obstruction by designing opt-out paths that are as straightforward as opt-in paths. It also ensures that the user's choice persists, so the system does not keep re-asking until the user gives up. When privacy protective actions are easy, the system signals respect, and it reduces the chance that people accept tracking simply to escape annoyance. Interface manipulation also includes sneaking, which is when the system collects or enables something without clear notice at the moment it matters. This can happen when a product turns on tracking by default and offers only a vague disclosure later. It can happen when a toggle's label does not match what it actually does, such as a setting labeled for performance improvement that also enables third-party advertising sharing. Sneaking can also happen in subscription-like settings, where a user thinks they have disabled tracking, but the system continues to collect data for other, internal, purposes that still feel like profiling. Privacy engineering eliminates sneaking by aligning labels, behavior, and user expectations. If a setting says it disables tracking, then tracking should actually stop in a meaningful way, not merely be renamed. If a system must collect certain operational data, it should explain that clearly without pretending it is optional. The more honest and consistent the system is, the less room there is for deceptive interpretation. Another dark pattern category is forced action, where users are pressured to agree to broader data use as a condition of accessing features that do not truly require it. Sometimes a service needs certain data to function, but often tracking is presented as mandatory even when it is not. This creates a coercive environment where consent is not a real choice. Privacy engineering counters this by separating what is necessary for the core service from what is optional for business optimization, and by ensuring that users can access the basic service without agreeing to unnecessary profiling. When optional uses are truly optional, the product has to earn permission by explaining value rather than by threatening loss. This is not only more respectful, it is also more stable because users who choose optional features knowingly are less likely to feel deceived later. Forced action may improve short-term metrics, but it often creates long-term trust erosion. Dark patterns also appear in defaults, which can be subtle because defaults often feel like neutral settings. Defaults are powerful because many users accept them, especially when they are busy or uncertain. A privacy-hostile default enables broad sharing, persistent tracking, and long retention, while requiring users to do work to reduce exposure. A privacy-respecting default minimizes collection and sharing unless the user actively chooses otherwise. Eliminating dark patterns by design often means choosing defaults that favor privacy, then making it easy for users to opt into optional features if they understand and want them. This shifts the system away from extracting data through inertia and toward earning data through clear value. It also reduces the organization's reliance on confusion because the system is not built on the assumption that users will miss hidden settings. Defaults are therefore a privacy control because they determine the baseline exposure for the majority of users. Misleading language is another area where manipulation can be disguised as clarity. Terms like improve your experience, personalize content, and make things better can be so broad that they effectively communicate nothing. When language is vague, it becomes a tool of persuasion rather than information. Privacy engineering counters this by requiring plain descriptions of what data is used for, what changes for the user, and who receives the data. It also avoids implying dire consequences for opting out when the real consequence is simply less targeted marketing. Clear language reduces manipulation because it makes the trade-off visible, and it helps users make choices aligned with their values. It also helps the organization because it reduces misunderstanding and complaints later. A system that relies on vague language is often hiding complexity or overreach, while a system that can explain itself plainly is usually more disciplined. Eliminating dark patterns also requires aligning internal incentives and workflows with ethical design, because design manipulation often reappears if teams are rewarded for acceptance at any cost. Privacy engineering can help by defining success metrics that do not depend on tricking users, such as measuring user satisfaction with controls, measuring reduction in unnecessary data collection, and measuring trust outcomes like lower complaint rates. It can also help by building review processes that catch manipulative patterns before they ship, treating privacy UX as part of the product's quality bar. This is not about slowing everything down. It is about preventing the costly cycle where a manipulative design ships, triggers backlash, and then requires emergency rework. When privacy-respecting patterns are built into templates and design systems, teams can move fast without drifting into manipulation. Guardrails that support ethical defaults make good behavior easier than bad behavior. A key misunderstanding among beginners is to assume that if the user clicked agree, then the system is in the clear. Clicking is not the same as understanding, and compliance is not the same as consent. Another misunderstanding is that privacy-respecting choices necessarily reduce usability, when in reality, confusing consent flows often harm usability far more than clear ones. There is also a misconception that dark patterns are only about consent pop-ups, but manipulation can appear in account creation flows, notification prompts, location requests, and any moment where the system asks for permission. Privacy engineering treats every permission request as a high-stakes moment because it shapes future data flows and future influence. Eliminating dark patterns, therefore, means auditing the entire journey, not just the visible consent dialog. The more consistent and fair the journey is, the less likely users are to feel trapped or tricked. When you eliminate dark patterns by design, you are building privacy outcomes into the user experience rather than treating privacy as a legal disclaimer. You create symmetric choices so opt-in and opt-out are equally clear and equally easy, and you avoid bundling unrelated decisions into one forced acceptance. You remove obstruction by making privacy-protective paths straightforward and by honoring user choices over time without re-asking until they give up. You eliminate sneaking by ensuring labels match behavior and by making tracking and sharing visible in plain language at the right moment. You choose privacy-friendly defaults and require real, intentional user action for optional profiling. You also align internal incentives and design review so ethical patterns remain stable across releases. When users feel respected and in control, the system becomes safer because it does not rely on confusion, and privacy becomes a lived experience rather than a promise buried in settings.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.